Chapter 1. The Universal Truth About Assumptions. You know what they say about assumptions, right? They make an ass out of you in emption. Or something like that. Point is, the hegemony made a really big assumption about humanity, and it was about to bite them in their collective, well-armored rear ends. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how the most technologically advanced military alliance in the galaxy managed to get schooled by a bunch of primates who'd only figured out faster-than-light travel about 3 decades ago. My name's Alex Reeves, and I'm what you might generously call a military liaison between Earth and the galactic hegemony. What that actually means is I'm the guy who gets to stand in fancy meeting rooms and watch alien bureaucrats argue about whether humans are a developing species or a barely contained catastrophe waiting to happen. The jury's still out on that one, honestly. The whole mess started about 6 months ago when the hegemony decided that humanity needed to be properly integrated into galactic society. You see, when we first made contact with the galaxy at large, we were kind of like that kid who shows up to the physics class having never heard of Newton, but somehow built a working fusion reactor in their garage. Impressive? Sure. Concerning? Absolutely. The hegemony had rules, you see. Lots of them. Rules about how spacefaring civilizations should behave, what technologies they should develop in what order, and most importantly, how they should conduct warfare. It was all very civilized and orderly, like a cosmic homeowners association with really big guns. And then there were humans. Chapter 2. The Diplomatic Dance of Doom 6 months ago. The meeting room on Hegemony Station Kappa 7 was the kind of place designed to make you feel small and insignificant. Soaring ceilings, holographic displays showing off various member worlds, and enough marble to build a small moon. The air recycling system even pumped in something that smelled vaguely like jasmine mixed with ozone. Very fancy. Very intimidating. Sitting across from me was Counselor Vexthara, a Gentari whose species looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a philosophy professor, and given the result really expensive suits. Her compound eyes reflected the light in that way that made you wonder if she was reading your soul, or just trying to figure out if you were edible. The humans, she began, in that tone that suggested she was discussing a particularly unpleasant medical condition, have been problematic. I leaned back in my chair, which was probably worth more than my apartment back on Earth. Problematic how, exactly? She gestured to a holographic display that materialized between us, showing what looked like a greatest hits reel of human military engagements over the past 30 years. Ships exploding, things that definitely shouldn't explode exploding, and a lot of very confused-looking alien faces. Your species, Vexthara continued, seems to have a disturbing tendency to ignore established military doctrine. We prefer to think of it as innovative tactical thinking, I replied, watching a human destroyer somehow managing to take out 3 Corvani battlecruisers using what appeared to be mining equipment and pure spite. You strapped engines to an asteroid and crashed it into a hegemony patrol fleet. In our defense, they were shooting at us at the time. You jury-rigged a merchant vessel into a makeshift carrier using construction drones and sheet metal. Again, active combat situation. We work with what we have. Vexthara's mandibles twitched in what I'd learned was the Gentari equivalent of a frustrated sigh. And then there was the Proxima incident. Ah yes, the Proxima incident. That one had really ruffled some feathers. Or whatever the equivalent was for species without feathers. It had started as a routine patrol mission that went sideways when we encountered a hegemony training exercise that looked suspiciously like an invasion fleet heading toward human space. Captain Riley O'Sullivan. And yes, I know. The name makes him sound like either a space pirate or someone who should be tending bar in Boston, but the man could command a starship like Mozart conducted symphonies, had been in charge of the human response. When faced with a fleet of ships that outgunned him 50-1, he'd done what any reasonable human would do in that situation. He'd improvised. The Proxima incident was a misunderstanding, I said diplomatically. Your captain turned a mining laser into a ship killer weapon and used it to cut through the hull of a hegemony dreadnought. Technically, it was already a ship-killer weapon. We just repurposed it. He then proceeded to use the dreadnought's own debris as improvised projectiles against the rest of the fleet. Waste not, want not. It's very environmental of us. Vexthara stared at me for a long moment. I got the distinct impression she was weighing whether it would be diplomatically acceptable to reach across the table and strangle me with her secondary manipulator appendages. This is precisely why the Hegemony Council has decided that humanity requires guidance. And there it was. The real reason I was sitting in this overpriced conference room instead of back home watching old movies and eating questionable takeout. The hegemony had decided that humans were too unpredictable to be left to their own devices. and they were going to do something about it. Chapter 3. The Academy of Galactic Superiority 5 months ago. The Hegemony Military Academy was exactly what you'd expect from a collection of species who'd spent the last few thousand years perfecting the art of organized violence. It was massive, gleaming, and filled with beings who looked like they could bench press a small spacecraft. My guide was Commander Torgak, a member of the Brutari species who looked like someone had taken a rhinoceros, given it opposable thumbs, and enrolled it in officer training school. He was also, despite appearances, surprisingly well-read, and had a habit of quoting ancient military philosophers at inappropriate moments. "The Academy trains the finest military minds in the galaxy," he rumbled as we walked through corridors lined with holographic displays showing famous battles and strategic victories. "Here, we learn that warfare is an art form, with rules and patterns that have been refined over millennia." I nodded politely while privately wondering how many of those refined patterns involved humans doing something completely insane and somehow making it work. We passed groups of cadets from various species, all looking appropriately serious and military-like. There were the graceful Seranae, whose idea of combat apparently involved a lot of elegant dancing with weapons. The methodical Corvani, who approached warfare like a chess match played with spaceships. The stoic Themarian, who believed that the best defense was an even better defense. And then there were the human cadets. You could spot them immediately, not just because they were the only ones who looked like they'd evolved from something that used to swing from trees, but because they were the only ones who seemed to be having actual conversations, instead of reciting tactical doctrines at each other. "The humans," Torgak observed, following my gaze, "have been challenging to integrate." I watched as one of the human cadets, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, was apparently explaining something to a group of aliens using animated hand gestures, and what looked suspiciously like napkin sketches. Challenging how? They asked too many questions. Questions? Wrong questions. Instead of asking, "How do we follow established doctrine?" they ask, "Why is this the doctrine?" Or, "What if we tried something completely different?" Or, most disturbingly, "What if we just ignored the rules entirely?" The human cadet was now demonstrating something by using salt shakers and utensils to represent starships. His alien audience looked increasingly confused and possibly a little horrified. "Last week," Torgak continued, "Cadet Blake asked his instructor why we don't simply ram enemy ships with unmanned vessels traveling at significant fractions of light speed." That's actually not a bad question. The instructor spent 3 hours explaining the Geneva Conventions of Space, the hegemony rules of engagement, and the Accords on Civilized Warfare. And what did Blake say? He asked if there was an express version. We continued through the academy, and I noticed something interesting. While the alien cadets moved in neat, orderly groups discussing strategy and tactics in hushed, respectful tones, the humans seemed to be everywhere at once, poking into things they probably shouldn't be poking into, and asking questions that made their instructors look like they were developing ulcers. "The thing is," I said to Torgak as we watched a human cadet named Foster apparently trying to convince a Seranae instructor that sometimes the most elegant solution was just to hit things really, really hard. Humans don't really do by the book very well. So we've noticed. We're more of a make-it-up-as-we-go-along species. This is also apparent. And sometimes, that actually works out better than following the rules. Torgak turned to look at me, his massive head tilting in what I'd learned was the Brutari expression for deep contemplation, mixed with mild concern. This is what worries the Hegemony Council. Chapter 4. The War Games begin 4 months ago. 3 weeks after my academy visit, I found myself on the observation deck of the Hegemony command ship Inexorable Logic, watching what was supposed to be a routine training exercise designed to demonstrate proper military doctrine to the human cadets. The setup was simple, at least in theory. The humans would be assigned to various hegemony units and participate in a standard fleet engagement simulation. Red team versus blue team, with predetermined objectives and victory conditions. Everything nice and tidy and educational. What could possibly go wrong? Admiral Kexmora, the exercise commander, was a Gentari like Counselor Vexthara, but where the counselor was all diplomatic politeness and barely concealed irritation, the Admiral radiated the kind of confidence that came from winning battles for the better part of a century. Her compound eyes tracked the tactical displays with the precision of a predator, and when she spoke, people listened. "The exercise will demonstrate the superiority of coordinated tactics and established doctrine," she announced to the assembled observers. The human cadets will see firsthand how proper military training and adherence to protocol leads to victory. I glanced around the observation deck, which was filled with hegemony officials, academy instructors, and what looked suspiciously like military analysts taking very detailed notes. This wasn't just a training exercise, it was a demonstration. The hegemony was making a point about the value of their way of doing things. The red team consisted of veteran hegemony units following standard battle doctrine. Professional, experienced, and absolutely certain they knew what they were doing. The blue team was a mixed bag of academy cadets from various species, with human cadets integrated throughout the fleet. On paper, it wasn't even close. The red team had more ships, better crews, and centuries of tactical knowledge. The blue team was basically a collection of students with a few humans thrown in to shake things up. "Simulation commencing," announced the AI controller. "Red team, you may begin your approach." I watched the tactical display as the red fleet moved into a textbook formation. Cruisers in the center, destroyers on the flanks, fighters screening the advance. It was the kind of formation you'd see in military academies across the galaxy, refined through countless battles and proven effective time and time again. The blue team's response was less orthodox. "Are they supposed to be doing that?" asked one of the observers, pointing at the display where several blue team vessels seemed to be moving in random directions. Admiral Kexmore's mandibles twitched slightly. They appear to be repositioning. What they were actually doing, I realized as I watched more carefully, was splitting up into small, seemingly uncoordinated groups. No formation, no apparent plan, just ships going every which way like someone had kicked over an anthill. "This is what happens when you don't follow proper doctrine," one of the instructors muttered. "They're going to be picked off one by one." The red team evidently agreed, because they immediately adjusted their formation to take advantage of the blue team's apparent disorganization. Cruiser groups moved to engage the scattered blue ships, expecting easy victories against isolated targets. That's when things got interesting. The first blue team ship the red fleet engaged was a light cruiser, with what looked like a standard crew complement. On paper, it should have been outgunned and quickly destroyed by the red team destroyer squadron moving to intercept it. Instead, the blue ship did something no self-respecting military vessel was supposed to do in a proper fleet engagement. It ran away. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a feint, just a flat-out engines at maximum power see-you-later retreat directly toward the nearest asteroid field. "Cowardice," sniffed Admiral Kexmora. "They abandoned their positions at the first sign of resistance." But I was watching the tactical display more carefully, and I noticed something the Admiral had missed. The blue ship wasn't just running away. It was leading the red squadron somewhere specific. The destroyer squadron followed their apparently fleeing prey into the asteroid field, where proper tactics dictated they should be able to corner and destroy the isolated cruiser. What proper tactics didn't account for was the cruiser suddenly stopping, spinning around, and launching what appeared to be mining charges into the asteroids around the pursuing destroyers. The resulting debris field didn't destroy the red ships. This was just a simulation after all. But it did completely disrupt their formation and leave them vulnerable to the blue team fighters that had apparently been hiding among the asteroids the entire time. "Ambush tactics," I observed, "using the terrain to their advantage." "Highly unconventional," Admiral Kexmora replied, though she sounded less dismissive than before. The pattern repeated itself across the battlefield. Blue team ships would appear to make tactical mistakes, breaking formation, retreating from advantageous positions, engaging in apparently pointless maneuvers, only to somehow turn those apparent mistakes into unexpected advantages. A blue team destroyer that seemed to be fleeing from a superior force suddenly reversed course and rammed its pursuer, not to destroy it, but to lock it in place while other blue ships moved to flank positions. A cruiser that appeared to be out of position turned out to be perfectly placed to cut off a red team retreat route. Fighters that seemed to be operating without coordination suddenly converged on red team capital ships from completely unexpected directions. And threading through it all were the human cadets, visible on the communications channels as they coordinated these seemingly chaotic maneuvers, with a mixture of technical jargon and what sounded like sports commentary. "Foster, you magnificent bastard! Swing around and hit them from behind!" "Blake, I need you to pretend to be retreating again. Really sell it this time." "Davis, can you make that cruiser do that spinny thing you did last week?" "You mean a tactical spiral?" "Yeah, that, but with more spinning." Admiral Kexmora's compound eyes were tracking the tactical display with what I was beginning to recognize as fascinated horror. The red team, despite every advantage in firepower, experience, and tactical knowledge, was being systematically outmaneuvered by what appeared to be complete chaos. This is not how fleet engagements are supposed to proceed, she muttered. Maybe that's the point, I suggested. She turned those multifaceted eyes on me. Explain. I gestured at the display, where a blue team corvette had just somehow managed to disable a red team cruiser by overloading its shields with what appeared to be jury-rigged mining equipment. The red team knows exactly how fleet engagements are supposed to proceed. They've trained for it, studied it, perfected it. They know all the right moves, all the proper responses, all the standard tactics. As they should. These tactics have proven effective for centuries. Right. But the humans don't know what they're supposed to do. So instead of following the rules, they're just solving problems. On the display, the red team was attempting a standard pincer maneuver that should have trapped half the blue fleet. Instead, the blue ships scattered in all directions like startled fish, only to regroup moments later in a completely different configuration that somehow left the red team's pincer movement attacking empty space. They treat each engagement like a puzzle, I continued, warming to the theme. Not like a chess match with predetermined moves, but like, I don't know, like they're trying to fix a broken engine with whatever tools happen to be lying around. That is not proper military doctrine. No, but it's working. And it was. As the simulation continued, the red team found themselves increasingly frustrated by an enemy that refused to behave according to any recognizable pattern. Every time they adapted their tactics to counter what the blue team had done, the blue team did something completely different. The end came suddenly. While the red team was concentrated on what appeared to be the main blue team force, a group of blue ships that had been written off as non-combatants, support vessels, transports, even a few supposed damaged craft, suddenly revealed themselves as a fully operational strike force and hit the red team's command ship from a direction that shouldn't have been possible. The simulation ended with the red team flagship's destruction and the surrender of the remaining red forces. The observation deck was dead silent. Admiral Kexamora stared at the tactical display for a long moment, her mandibles working silently. Finally, she turned to the communications officer. "Get me a full tactical analysis of the blue team's performance," she ordered. "I want to know how they did that." "Yes, Admiral. Should I also prepare a critique of their doctrine violations?" The Admiral looked back at the display, where the blue team ships were now forming up in what appeared to be a perfect textbook formation, as if they'd known proper military doctrine all along and had simply chosen to ignore it. "No," she said quietly. "I think we need to understand their doctrine first." Chapter 5. The Debrief of Doom. The post-exercise debriefing room was one of those places designed for serious military discussions. Maps, holographic displays, comfortable chairs for senior officers, and enough recording equipment to document every word for posterity. It was also currently filled with very confused alien military personnel, trying to figure out how their carefully planned demonstration of tactical superiority had turned into an object lesson in creative problem-solving. I sat in the back, officially present as a human liaison, but mostly just trying not to smile too obviously as Admiral Kexamora worked her way through what had clearly been a very long and humbling afternoon. The human cadets had been called in for individual debriefings, and the results were illuminating. "Cadet Foster," the Admiral began, consulting her notes. "Can you explain the tactical reasoning behind your spinny thing maneuver?" Foster, who looked like he should have been playing college football instead of flying spaceships, scratched his head thoughtfully. "Well, Admiral, the enemy cruiser was trying to get a targeting lock on Davis's ship, right? But their targeting system looked like it was designed for conventional evasion patterns. So I figured if we could make Davis's ship move in a way that didn't match any standard evasion protocol, it might confuse their targeting AI long enough for Blake to get into position for a flanking attack." "And this spinny thing?" "Oh, that's just what we call it when you use your maneuvering thrusters to rotate the ship while maintaining forward velocity. Creates an irregular movement pattern that's hard to predict. Davis is really good at it. He used to be a stunt pilot before he joined the Academy." Admiral Kexamora made a note. "I see, and the mining charges in the asteroid field?" "That was Blake's idea." He noticed that the simulation parameters included debris damage, so we figured we could use environmental hazards as weapons. The mining charges were just the most efficient way to create a controlled debris field. "Controlled debris field," the Admiral repeated slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "We calculated the blast patterns to create maximum disruption while minimizing actual damage to the red team ships. We weren't trying to destroy them, just mess up their formation so our fighters could get better attack angles." The Admiral looked like she was developing a headache. "And the ramming attack?" "Oh, that wasn't a ramming attack," Foster said, looking slightly offended. "We just needed to lock that destroyer in place for 30 seconds. The collision was calculated to disable both ships' engines without breaching the hulls. Basic physics: if you know the mass and velocity of both vessels, you can predict the exact outcome of the collision. Basic physics, Admiral Kexmora muttered. Yes, ma'am. Newton's laws of motion apply to spaceships just like everything else. The debriefing continued for another hour, with each human cadet explaining their actions in the same matter-of-fact way that Foster had. To them, what they'd done wasn't revolutionary or particularly clever. They'd simply identified problems and solved them using whatever tools were available. The alien officers, meanwhile, looked like they were witnessing the slow collapse of everything they thought they knew about military strategy. After the cadets were dismissed, Admiral Kexmora turned to the assembled instructors and analysts. Analysis? Commander Torgak was the first to speak. They don't think like soldiers, he said slowly. They think like engineers, or maybe scientists. Each tactical situation is a problem to be solved, not a scenario with predetermined responses. They improvise constantly, added another instructor, a Serenai whose elegant features were marred by what looked like profound confusion. Even when standard doctrine would be more efficient, they choose unpredictable alternatives. Because unpredictability is its own advantage, I interjected from the back of the room. When your enemy can't predict your actions, they can't effectively counter them. Admiral Kexmora fixed me with those compound eyes. But unpredictability also means unreliability. How do you coordinate complex operations when no one knows what anyone else is going to do? You don't coordinate operations, I replied. You coordinate objectives. Tell them what needs to be accomplished, not how to accomplish it, and let them figure out the details. That's not how military organizations function. It's how human military organizations function. The room fell quiet for a moment. Then one of the analysts, a young Themarian who'd been taking detailed notes throughout the debriefing, cleared his throat nervously. Admiral, if I may? Proceed. I've been reviewing the tactical data from the simulation, and there's something interesting. The human cadets weren't just improvising randomly. There was an underlying pattern to their actions, a kind of meta-strategy. The Admiral leaned forward. Explain. The analyst activated a holographic display showing the flow of the battle from start to finish. Look at the timing of their maneuvers. Every time the red team adapted to counter a blue team tactic, the humans had already moved on to something else. It's as if they were deliberately staying one step ahead of the red team's decision-making process. They were observing and adapting in real time, Commander Torgak rumbled, learning from each engagement and adjusting their approach accordingly. More than that, the analyst continued. They were using the red team's adherence to doctrine against them. Because they knew how the red team would respond to standard scenarios, they could create situations that would provoke predictable responses, and then exploit those responses. Admiral Kexmora stared at the display for a long moment. They turned our tactical knowledge into a weakness. Not a weakness, I corrected. A limitation. Your doctrine works great against enemies who also follow doctrine, but against an enemy who doesn't recognize the rules become irrelevant, the Admiral finished. Or worse, they become a liability. The meeting broke up shortly after that, with various officers and instructors heading off to write reports and reconsider everything they thought they knew about military strategy. Admiral Kexmora asked me to stay behind, and we found ourselves alone in the debriefing room with its now silent holographic displays. Mr. Reeves, she said finally, what would happen if humanity were to face a real enemy? Not a training simulation, but an actual military threat. I thought about that for a moment, considering everything I'd seen over the past few weeks. The human cadets with their casual disregard for established doctrine. Captain O'Sullivan and his improvised solutions to impossible problems. The way humans seem to treat warfare not as an art form with established rules, but as a series of engineering challenges to be solved with whatever materials were at hand. Admiral, I said, I think you're asking the wrong question. How so? You're asking what would happen if humanity faced an enemy. But the real question is, what would happen if an enemy faced humanity? She considered this, her mandibles working silently. And your assessment? I think, I said, standing up to leave, that it would depend on whether that enemy was prepared for an opponent who didn't know they were supposed to lose. Chapter 6. The Real Thing. 3 months ago. 2 months after the simulation debacle, I was standing on the bridge of the human heavy cruiser Reasonable Doubt, watching Captain Mitchell Barnes prepare for what would be our first real test against an actual hostile force. The scenario was straightforward enough. A rogue hegemony battle fleet had declared independence and was threatening to glass a civilian colony in the Outer Rim. The political situation was complicated. Something about a military commander who decided that the hegemony's new cooperation with primitives policy was tantamount to treason. But the tactical situation was simple enough. Bad guys with big guns were about to hurt innocent people, and someone needed to stop them. The someone, in this case, was a hastily assembled joint task force consisting of 3 hegemony cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 1 human ship that was currently in the process of analyzing stellar physics with the intensity of a doctoral thesis defense. Captain Barnes was one of those officers who looked like he should have been teaching physics at a university instead of commanding a starship. Thin, thoughtful, with the kind of glasses that suggested he did a lot of reading in his spare time. Which, given that his ship's library contained more engineering journals than military histories, was probably accurate. "Captain," reported Lieutenant Commander Chen from the tactical station. "Enemy fleet is maintaining standard defensive formation. Battleships in the center, cruiser screen, fighter patrols. By the book stuff." "Any word from the other ships in our task force?" Barnes asked. Chen consulted her display. "The hegemony cruiser Stalwart Doctrine reports ready for standard engagement. The destroyers, methodical and precise, are in formation and awaiting orders. Tell them to hold position until we make our move," Barnes said. "And Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir?" "Once we start, things are going to get weird. Make sure they know that whatever we do that looks completely insane is probably intentional. I was aboard as an observer again, documenting how human tactics worked in real combat situations. The entire engagement was being recorded for later analysis by the Hegemony Military Council, who wanted to see exactly how humans would handle a by-the-book military scenario when facing an actual enemy instead of a simulation. "Mr. Reeves," Barnes said, turning to me, "are you recording this for the Hegemony observers?" I gestured to the camera equipment that had been set up on the bridge. "All set, Captain." "Excellent. Helm, take us toward the enemy fleet. But not too fast. I want them to think we're being cautious." The reasonable doubt began its approach toward the rogue fleet. On paper, it should have been a massacre. The enemy fleet had 12 capital ships, twice as many fighters, an overwhelming firepower advantage. Standard tactical doctrine said we should either retreat or attempt a desperate last stand that would at least delay the enemy advance. Instead, Captain Barnes did something that no military academy would have recommended. He called them on the phone. "Enemy fleet, this is Captain Mitchell Barnes of the Terran Defense Force. I'd like to speak with your commanding officer about the terms of your surrender." The silence on the communication channel was deafening. Finally, a voice responded. Admiral Rextar, one of the War College's most respected tactical instructors and the actual commander of the rogue fleet. "Captain Barnes, I believe you may be confused about the tactical situation. You are outnumbered and outgunned. Perhaps you meant to discuss the terms of your own surrender?" "Not really, no," Barnes replied cheerfully. "You see, Admiral, I've been reviewing your tactical deployment, and I have to say, it's very impressive. Textbook formation, optimal ship positioning, excellent coordination. There's just one problem. Which is? You're assuming we're going to fight you." Another pause. Longer this time. "Captain, you are a military force defending innocent civilians against hostile action. Fighting is generally considered the expected response." "Well, yes, that would be the traditional approach. But we're humans, Admiral. We don't really do traditional." I watched the tactical display as the reasonable doubt continued its approach, still moving slowly and apparently making no aggressive moves. The enemy fleet maintained its formation, but I could see confusion beginning to creep into their positioning as they tried to figure out what we were planning. "Captain Barnes," Admiral Rextar said, his voice carrying a note of professional concern. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that this entire engagement is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology," Barnes replied. "You're approaching this as if it's a military problem to be solved through force of arms. But we don't see a military problem. We see an engineering problem." "An engineering problem?" "Think about it, Admiral. What do humans do when faced with a problem? We study it. We experiment. We try different approaches until we find something that works. And right now you've just presented us with a really interesting problem." On the tactical display, the reasonable doubt had moved into what looked like an attack position, but hadn't opened fire. The other ships in our task force were maintaining their distance, clearly confused by our approach. "The problem," Barnes continued, "is how to neutralize a superior enemy force without causing casualties on either side. It's the kind of challenge that human engineers and scientists love to sink their teeth into." "Captain, this is warfare, not a research project." "Is it?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a really complex three-dimensional physics problem with moving variables and real-time constraints. The fact that some of the variables happen to be armed is just an additional parameter to account for." Lieutenant Commander Chen looked up from her station. "Captain, We're in position. Excellent, Admiral, Barnes said, returning to the communication channel. Have you ever heard of the Kobayashi Maru scenario? I am not familiar with this reference. It was a training simulation used by one of Earth's military academies. A no-win scenario designed to test how cadets would handle certain defeat. The interesting thing was that one cadet actually managed to beat it. How? He reprogrammed the simulation. And that's when we opened fire, not at the enemy fleet, but at specific points in space that seemed completely empty. Except they weren't empty. They were the locations where, according to the tactical analysis Barnes had been running since we arrived, various stellar phenomena would manifest based on the gravitational interactions of the ships in the system. By targeting those specific coordinates with precisely calculated energy discharges, we were essentially reprogramming the physics of the engagement. The result was spectacular. Artificial gravity wells appeared throughout the enemy formation, disrupting their neat tactical arrangement and pulling ships out of position. Electromagnetic pulses, generated by the interaction of our weapons' fire with naturally occurring cosmic phenomena, disabled communications and targeting systems across the enemy fleet, and solar wind patterns, redirected by our precisely placed energy discharges, created interference that made long-range sensors useless. Within minutes, the superior enemy fleet had been reduced to a collection of isolated ships operating blind in a sea of physics that no longer behaved according to predictable patterns. How? Admiral Rextar's voice came over the communication channel, barely audible through the static. We read the technical specifications for this star system, Barnes replied. All of them, including the parts about how stellar phenomena are modeled and how they interact with ship-based energy sources. Once we understood the rules the universe was operating under, it was just a matter of using those rules to our advantage. That's not warfare. No, Admiral, it's engineering. And when you're human, there's not really much difference. With the enemy fleet disabled and confused, the hegemony ships in our task force moved in to accept their surrender. The entire engagement had lasted less than 20 minutes, with 0 casualties and minimal damage to either side. As we headed back to base, I found myself thinking about what I'd just witnessed. The humans hadn't just won. They'd solved the problem in a way that nobody else would have even thought to attempt. Captain, I said to Barnes as we reviewed the tactical logs, how did you know that would work? He shrugged. I didn't, really. But I knew the standard approach would result in a lot of people dying, and that seemed like a suboptimal outcome. So we tried something else. Something else turned out to be revolutionary. The humans had just demonstrated that warfare didn't have to be about destroying the enemy. It could be about outsmarting the environment itself. It was going to change everything. Chapter 7. The Council of Concerned Aliens, 2 months ago. The emergency session of the Hegemony Military Council was supposed to be a closed-door meeting, but somehow I'd ended up with an invitation. Probably because someone figured they needed a human perspective on what was being described in the official reports as highly irregular tactical developments. The council chamber was even more impressive than the meeting room where I'd first encountered Counselor Vexthara. Massive holographic displays showed star maps, fleet positions, and what looked suspiciously like a real-time tracking system for every human military unit currently operating in hegemony space. Around the circular table sat the military leadership of the galaxy's most powerful alliance. Admiral Kexmora, looking like she'd aged about 10 years in the past few months. General Wexthar of the Brutari Defense Forces, whose species' idea of military strategy involved hitting things with increasingly large hammers until they stopped being problems. Fleet Commander Sithara of the Serenai, whose people had turned warfare into something resembling a deadly ballet. And about a dozen other representatives from member species, all of whom looked like they were attending their own funeral. The situation, Admiral Kexmora began, has evolved beyond our initial projections. That was one way to put it. In the 4 months since Captain Barnes had reprogrammed stellar physics to disable a rogue fleet, human military units had been involved in no fewer than 17 separate engagements across hegemony space. Pirates, separatist movements, rogue commanders, and at least one case of what the official reports described as aggressive misunderstanding, with a species that communicated primarily through interpretive dance. In every single case, the humans had won. More importantly, at least from the hegemony's perspective, they'd won using methods that were completely outside established military doctrine. The vegan separatist fleet, Admiral Kexmora continued, calling up a tactical display, was neutralized by a human task force that somehow managed to convince the separatists' AI-controlled defense grid to shut down their own ships. How? Asked General Wexthar, whose species was apparently immune to concepts like electronic warfare and psychological operations. They uploaded a virus that convinced the AI it was experiencing an existential crisis, I replied. Then they provided counseling. The silence that followed was the kind you usually hear in morgues or libraries. They counseled an artificial intelligence, Fleet Commander Sithara said slowly. The AI was programmed to protect separatist assets, but the humans convinced it that the greatest threat to separatist assets was the separatist leadership's tactical incompetence. So it did what any rational AI would do. It removed the threat by turning off their own fleet, by placing the fleet in protective custody until more qualified leadership could be found. General Wexthar's massive head turned toward me with the slow, inevitable motion of a planetary collision. And the Corvani mining dispute? Ah, that one was creative even by human standards. I called up another display showing what had been a three-way territorial conflict between mining corporations that had escalated to the point of armed spacecraft shooting at each other over asteroid mining rights. Captain Wright's solution was to steal all the asteroids. Steal them? Technically, he relocated them to neutral space and declared them a nature preserve. Hard to fight over mining rights when the things you want to mine are under environmental protection. How do you steal asteroids? Asked a Themarian council member, whose species was known for their methodical approach to everything, including expressing confusion. Very carefully and with a lot of industrial-grade tractor beams, I replied, plus some creative interpretations of interstellar salvage law. Admiral Keximora moved to the next case. The Syndicate blockade? Oh, that was beautiful, I said, unable to keep the admiration out of my voice. The crime syndicate had set up a blockade around the Kepler station trade routes using cloaked ships. Standard procedure would have been to sweep the area with sensor arrays until you found them, then engage in conventional ship-to-ship combat. Instead, Captain Torres broadcast an open-channel message claiming that he was a rival crime syndicate looking to horn in on their territory. Then he started insulting their professional competence, their choice of ships, their mothers, and their understanding of proper blockade tactics. The council members stared at me. Within an hour, the cloaked ships were shooting at each other instead of merchant vessels. Problem solved. They turned the criminals against themselves, Fleet Commander Sithara observed. Humans have a saying, there's no honor among thieves. Captain Torres just reminded the thieves of that fact. The litany continued. Human forces had resolved the Outer Rim piracy crisis by convincing the pirates that legitimate commerce was more profitable than raiding. They'd ended the Centauri border conflict by accidentally discovering that both sides were actually fighting over a translation error, and the disputed territory didn't exist. They'd stopped the Rigel system war by challenging the opposing commanders to settle their differences through a series of increasingly ridiculous contests that eventually devolved into a pie-eating competition. In every case, Admiral Kex Mora said when we'd finished reviewing the reports, human forces achieved tactical victory through unconventional means. Unconventional is putting it mildly, General Wexthar rumbled. These aren't military solutions, they're practical solutions, I finished. Humans don't really distinguish between military problems and any other kind of problems. A problem is a problem. The goal is to make it stop being a problem, preferably with minimum casualties and maximum efficiency. But military doctrine exists for a reason, protested the Themarian council member. Established tactics have been proven effective through centuries of warfare. Against enemies who also follow established tactics, I pointed out. But what happens when you face an enemy who doesn't know the rules? Or worse, an enemy who knows the rules but chooses to ignore them? That question hung in the air for a moment like a particularly unpleasant smell. Fleet Commander Sithara was the first to break the silence. You're suggesting that our adherence to doctrine has become a weakness. I'm suggesting that doctrine is a tool, not a religion. Tools are useful when they help you accomplish your objectives. When they don't, you get different tools. Or you make new ones, Admiral Keximora added quietly. Exactly. General Wexthar leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his massive frame. What you're describing isn't warfare, it's chaos. No, I replied, it's adaptation. Chaos would be random. What humans do is responsive. They observe, they analyze, they experiment, and they adapt. Sometimes the solutions look chaotic because they're not based on familiar patterns, but there's always logic behind them. Even the pie-eating contest? Especially the pie-eating contest. 2 military commanders had been fighting over territorial control for 6 months, with thousands of casualties and no clear resolution. Captain Murphy challenged them to a contest of personal skill instead of military might, with the winner getting the disputed territory. No more casualties, conflict resolved in one afternoon, and everybody got pie. That's not military strategy, the Themarian protested. It's conflict resolution, I corrected. The goal wasn't to win a glorious battle. It was to stop people from dying over something that could be settled peacefully. Admiral Kexmora activated another display, this one showing deployment statistics for human forces over the past 6 months. The data supports Mr. Reeves' assessment. Human units have the highest mission success rate, the lowest casualty rate, and the shortest average conflict duration of any forces in the hegemony fleet. Because they cheat, General Wexthar grumbled. Because they win, Admiral Kexmora replied. And there it was, the fundamental question that had brought us all to this conference room. What was more important, following proper military doctrine, or actually accomplishing military objectives? The debate that followed lasted for hours, with various council members arguing the merits of tradition versus innovation, predictability versus effectiveness, and the value of military honor versus the value of actually achieving your goals without getting everyone killed. In the end, it was Admiral Kexmora who cut to the heart of the matter. The real question, she said, is whether we want to be right or whether we want to win. Explain, Councillor Vexthara requested. Our current doctrine is correct according to everything we know about proper military strategy. It follows established principles, incorporates lessons learned from centuries of warfare, and provides reliable, predictable results. But human methods produce better results. They win engagements they should lose, resolve conflicts with minimal casualties, and accomplish objectives that conventional tactics can't achieve. So we can choose to be right, General Wexthar said slowly. Or we can choose to be effective. Exactly. The decision, when it came, was both inevitable and revolutionary. The hegemony would establish a new military doctrine based on adaptive problem-solving rather than rigid adherence to established tactics. Human officers would be assigned to training roles throughout the hegemony fleet, not to teach humans how to follow alien military doctrine, but to teach aliens how to think like humans. It wasn't a complete victory for either side. The hegemony would still maintain standard operating procedures for situations where conventional tactics were appropriate, and humans would still need to coordinate with alien forces in joint operations. But it was a recognition that military effectiveness was more important than military tradition. There is one condition, Admiral Kexmora said as the meeting drew to a close. Which is? I asked. We want to establish a joint training facility where our best officers can learn human tactical thinking, and we want you to oversee the program. I looked around the room at the assembled military leadership of the galaxy's most powerful alliance, all of them waiting for my response to what amounted to an offer to revolutionize galactic military doctrine. When do we start? I said. Chapter 8, The Test of All Tests. 1 month ago. 6 months later, I was standing on the observation deck of the Joint Training Facility New Paradigm, watching what the hegemony brass had decided would be the ultimate test of integrated human-alien tactical cooperation. The scenario was straightforward but daunting. A hostile alien fleet, not actually hostile, just very dedicated actors from the Hegemony War College, had invaded the Terran system and was threatening Earth itself. The Joint Task Force was outnumbered 3-1, outgunned by a significant margin, and facing an enemy that knew every standard tactical response in the book. The human ships in the task force were the heavy cruiser Lateral Thinking, the destroyer's Creative Solution and Improvised Response, and the light cruiser Adaptive Strategy. The alien vessels included ships from 6 different species, each bringing their own tactical traditions and approaches to combat. In other words, it was the kind of challenge that would either prove the new doctrine worked, or demonstrate spectacular failure in front of every military observer in the galaxy. Captain, reported Commander Takesh from the tactical station of the flagship Lateral Thinking. The Corvani officer had requested transfer to the joint program after experiencing human tactics firsthand during Captain Barnes's stellar phenomenon manipulation, and had become one of our most effective integration specialists. Captain Elena Vasquez, who had been promoted after several successful unconventional engagements, was in command of the overall task force. She looked as calm as if she were ordering coffee, which, given what I'd learned about human psychology, probably meant she was about to do something that would give alien observers nightmares. Enemy fleet is maintaining standard defensive formation, Takesh continued. Battleships in the center, cruiser screen fighter patrols. By the book positioning. Any communications from our alien task force partners? Vasquez asked. The Serenai cruiser Elegant Maneuver reports ready for coordinated action. The Brutari destroyer Methodical Destruction is prepared for direct engagement. The Themarian vessel Calculated Response has completed tactical analysis and is standing by. I watched the tactical display as the enemy fleet maintained its textbook formation. They were following every principle of established military doctrine, presenting a perfect example of how galactic warfare was supposed to be conducted. Which was exactly why Captain Vasquez was about to throw the textbook out the airlock. All ships, this is lateral thinking, she announced over the task force communication channel. We're going to try something new today. When I give the signal, I want every ship to do something that would make your tactical instructors cry. The response from the alien vessels was immediate and concerned. Captain Vasquez, came the voice of Commander Sethril from the Serenai cruiser. Could you be more specific about our tactical objectives? Our objective is to win, Vasquez replied. How we do that is up to each of you, but I want everyone to think beyond standard doctrine. This isn't about following the rules, it's about accomplishing the mission. What about coordination? Asked Captain Bremtok from the Brutari destroyer. Coordinate on results, not methods. Tell us what you're trying to achieve, and we'll adapt to support it. But don't wait for permission to be creative. I could practically hear the alien officers struggling with this concept. Everything in their training told them to follow established protocols, to coordinate through proper channels, to execute predetermined tactical responses. Vasquez was essentially telling them to ignore everything they'd ever learned about military organization. Enemy fleet is beginning its approach, Takesh reported. Standard battle formation, cruisers leading, battleships providing fire support. Perfect, Vasquez said. They're doing exactly what we expected them to do. Which is good because, Takesh asked, because when your enemy is predictable, you can plan for their predictability. The enemy fleet advanced with textbook precision, their formation designed to maximize firepower while minimizing vulnerability. It was the kind of approach that had worked for centuries against opponents who also followed established tactical doctrine. The human-alien task force's response was less conventional. The first to break formation was the Serenai cruiser, which suddenly began moving in what could only be described as a complex three-dimensional dance. The ship spiraled and twisted through space, its movements following patterns that were beautiful to watch, but made no apparent tactical sense. Elegant maneuver. What are you doing? Demanded Captain Bremtok. Creating art, replied Commander Sethril. My people believe that beauty confuses the enemy. They expect military precision, so we give them aesthetic complexity. The Brutari destroyer's response was more direct. Instead of maintaining formation, methodical destruction charged straight at the center of the enemy fleet, its weapons blazing. But instead of trying to destroy enemy ships, it was targeting empty space between them, creating a pattern of energy discharges that served no obvious purpose. Methodical destruction. Explain your attack pattern, Takesh requested. Building fear, Captain Bremtok rumbled. Enemy expects us to target their ships. We target their confidence instead. Make them wonder what we know that they don't. The Themarian vessel took yet another approach. Calculated response simply stopped moving entirely and began broadcasting what appeared to be mathematical equations on all frequencies. Calculated response, Vasquez called. Are you having technical difficulties? Negative, Captain. We are solving the engagement mathematically. Every possible tactical response the enemy might make has been calculated. We are broadcasting the solutions to confuse their tactical computers. I watched the tactical display as the enemy fleet's neat formation began to show signs of strain. They were facing an opponent that refused to behave according to any recognizable pattern. One ship was dancing, one was shooting at nothing, one was broadcasting math problems, and the human vessels hadn't even opened fire yet. Captain, Takesh said, his crystalline features reflecting his confusion. What is our tactical approach? We're going to do what humans do best, Vasquez replied. We're going to improvise. The lateral thinking suddenly accelerated toward the enemy fleet, but instead of following a direct attack vector, it began to weave between the other task force ships, apparently trying to coordinate their seemingly random actions into some kind of coherent strategy. All ships, Vasquez announced. I'm reading your tactical intentions, and I think I see what you're doing. Elegant maneuver. Your dance is disrupting their targeting algorithms. Methodical destruction. Your fear tactics are making them hesitate. Calculated response. Your mathematical broadcast is overloading their tactical computers. Now let's see if we can tie it all together. What happened next was unlike anything in the recorded history of galactic warfare. The human ships began to coordinate with their alien partners, not by imposing a unified tactical doctrine, but by amplifying each species' natural approach to combat. The creative solution began mirroring the Serenai vessel's movements, turning the elegant dance into a coordinated pattern that was both beautiful and tactically disruptive. The improvised response started targeting the same empty spaces as the Brutari destroyer, but with precisely calculated timing that turned the fear tactics into a genuine tactical advantage. The adaptive strategy began broadcasting complementary mathematical solutions that turned the Themarian equations into a form of electronic warfare. The result was a form of combat that transcended traditional tactical categories. It was part performance art, part psychological warfare, part mathematical theorem, and part pure improvisation. The enemy fleet, trained to respond to conventional military tactics, found themselves completely unable to adapt to an approach that combined multiple species' tactical philosophies into something entirely new. The engagement ended when the enemy commander, faced with an opponent he couldn't understand, predict, or counter, simply surrendered rather than continue fighting a battle that made no sense according to any military doctrine he'd ever studied. "How did you coordinate that?" Takesh asked as we returned to base. Each ship was using completely different tactical approaches, but somehow it all worked together. Captain Vasquez smiled. "That's the thing about humans. We're really good at pattern recognition. Once I understood what each ship was trying to accomplish, it was just a matter of finding ways to make their different approaches support each other instead of conflict with each other. But that requires understanding multiple different tactical philosophies simultaneously." "Sure, but that's not really different from understanding multiple different engineering disciplines, or scientific fields, or any other complex system. Humans are generalists. We're designed to synthesize information from multiple sources and find connections that specialists might miss." It was, I realized, the perfect demonstration of what made human tactical thinking so effective. Not that humans were necessarily better than other species at warfare, but that they were better at adapting to the unexpected, at finding connections between disparate elements, and at turning chaos into advantage. The galaxy was about to get a lot more interesting. Chapter 9. The new normal present day. 1 year after the joint training facility had opened, I found myself back on Earth, sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Denver and reading news reports from across the galaxy. The headlines told the story better than any official report could. Hegemony forces end 30-year border dispute using human-style negotiation. Piracy in Outer Rim reduced by 90% following implementation of adaptive patrol strategies. Military Academy enrollment at all-time high as species. Seek creative combat training. The galaxy had changed, and humanity had been the catalyst. Not because we were stronger or smarter or more advanced than everyone else, but because we approached problems differently. We saw rules as suggestions, limitations as challenges, and impossible situations as interesting puzzles waiting to be solved. My phone buzzed with an incoming message from Admiral Kex Mora, now serving as Director of Tactical Innovation for the entire Hegemony fleet. The message was brief and to the point, as her communications usually were. "New situation developing in the Vega sector. Could use human perspective. Interested?" I finished my coffee, closed my newsreader, and typed back. "On my way. What's the problem?" "Species that communicates through bioluminescent patterns has declared war on the Traders' Union. Standard diplomatic protocols ineffective." Sounds like a job for creative problem-solving. Exactly what I was thinking. Also, we may have accidentally started a revolution. I paused in my typing. Accidentally? Long story. Some of our newly trained officers got a bit enthusiastic about applying human tactical principles to non-military situations. Apparently, the concept of ignoring established protocols to achieve better outcomes has applications beyond warfare. Uh-oh. Indeed, we may need to establish some guidelines about when creative problem-solving is appropriate and when it constitutes sedition. I smiled as I headed for the spaceport. Some things never changed. The galaxy was a big, complicated place full of species with different ways of thinking, different approaches to problems, and different ideas about how things should work. Conflicts were inevitable, misunderstandings, territorial disputes, ideological differences, and the occasional case of someone deciding that violence was the best way to settle an argument. But now, when those conflicts arose, the galaxy had more tools for dealing with them. Not just military doctrine and established procedures, but creativity, adaptability, and the willingness to try something new when the old approaches weren't working. And sometimes, when you gave humans a complicated problem and told them that the conventional solutions weren't working, they'd come up with something completely unexpected that somehow made the problem go away. As my transport lifted off from Earth, heading for the hyperspace jump point that would take me back to the stars, I reflected on how much had changed since that first meeting with Counselor Vexthara. The hegemony had started out trying to teach humanity how to follow the rules of galactic civilization. Instead, humanity had taught the galaxy that sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to ignore the rules entirely. Chapter 10. The Revolution Will Be Improvised. 3 months later, I was standing in what used to be the Hegemony Military Council chamber, but which now looked more like a cross between a university lecture hall and a think tank brainstorming session. The formal table had been replaced with modular seating that could be reconfigured based on the type of problem being discussed. The marble walls were covered with whiteboards, holographic displays, and what appeared to be the galaxy's most expensive collection of coffee stains. Admiral Kexamora was reviewing the latest reports with what I'd learned to recognize as the expression of someone who was simultaneously proud and terrified of what they'd helped create. "The Vega sector situation has been resolved," she announced to the assembled group, which now included not just military officers but also economists, sociologists, anthropologists, and at least one former pirate who'd apparently become an expert in alternative logistics solutions. "How?" asked Commander Takesh, who had been promoted to Director of Interspecies Tactical Integration and was currently coordinating training programs across 17 different star systems. Captain Morrison convinced the bioluminescent species that they weren't actually declaring war. They were attempting to negotiate a trade agreement. Apparently, their light patterns for hostile intent and desire to establish mutually beneficial commercial relations are nearly identical. "Translation error?" I suggested. "Worse. Cultural assumption error." The Traders' Union assumed that any species that communicated through light patterns would follow the same basic protocols as every other species they'd encountered. They never considered that different species might have fundamentally different conceptual frameworks for the same ideas. General Wexthar, who had become surprisingly enthusiastic about human tactical principles once he realized they could be applied to hitting problems instead of just hitting enemies, leaned forward in his chair. "And the revolution?" Admiral Kexmora's mandibles twitched in what I'd learned was the Gentari equivalent of a rueful smile. "Well, that's where things get interesting. It turns out that when you teach military officers to question established protocols and find creative solutions to problems, some of them start applying those principles to civilian government as well." "Uh-oh," I said. "Indeed. We now have 17 different star systems that have optimized their governmental structures using human tactical principles. The good news is that corruption is down, efficiency is up, and citizen satisfaction ratings are at an all-time high. And the bad news? Technically, they've all committed treason by ignoring established hegemony administrative procedures." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone contemplated the implications of accidentally inspiring a galaxy-wide governmental revolution through military training programs. "So," I said finally, "what's the plan?" Admiral Kexmora activated a holographic display showing the governmental satisfaction ratings from the revolutionized systems. "Well, the pragmatic approach would be to officially adopt their innovations as new standard procedures, thereby retroactively making their actions legal. And the principled approach would be to court-martial 17 system governors and return them to the previous administrative structures, which were corrupt, inefficient, and widely despised by their populations." Fleet Commander Sithara, whose people had been particularly enthusiastic about applying aesthetic principles to governmental organizations, spoke up. "The Serenai delegation votes for pragmatism." "The Brutari concur," General Wexthar rumbled. "If something works better than the old way, we should use the new way." "The Corvani support efficiency optimization," Takesh added. "Logical analysis indicates that governmental systems should be judged by their results, not their adherence to tradition." One by one, the representatives from the various member species voiced their support for officially adopting the innovations that had emerged from applying human tactical thinking to civilian administration. It was, I realized, exactly the kind of practical problem-solving approach that humans had been bringing to military situations. Identify what works, discard what doesn't, and don't let tradition prevent you from implementing better solutions. "Very well," Admiral Kexamora said. "I'll recommend to the full council that we establish a new framework for governmental innovation based on adaptive principles rather than rigid protocols." "And the military applications?" I asked. "Are proceeding even better than we hoped." She activated another display showing conflict resolution statistics from across hegemony space. "Armed conflicts are down 67% over the past year. Average conflict duration has decreased by 78%. And most importantly, casualties in military engagements have dropped by 89%. "Because humans taught everyone to be more creative?" Takesh asked. "Because humans taught everyone that winning doesn't require destroying your opponent," I corrected. "Sometimes the best victory is one where everybody goes home alive and the problem gets solved without anyone having to die for it." Admiral Kexmora nodded. "We've had to create new categories for military outcomes. Victory through opponent surrender has been joined by victory through problem elimination, victory through environmental manipulation, victory through psychological warfare, and my personal favorite, victory through competitive pie consumption." "How often does that last one come up?" General Wexthar asked. "More often than you'd think. Humans have discovered that many conflicts can be resolved through formalized competition in non-lethal activities. Species that might fight wars over territorial disputes will sometimes settle them through contests of skill, strength, or endurance instead. And this works? Captain Murphy has resolved 14 separate conflicts through various forms of competitive consumption alone. Pie-eating, drinking contests, speed-eating challenges. Apparently, there's something about the combination of physical challenge and mild absurdity that makes it difficult for opponents to maintain serious hostility. I thought about that for a moment. It makes sense, actually. If you can get people to laugh together, it's harder for them to want to kill each other. Human psychology continues to be both fascinating and strategically valuable, Admiral Xenobiology observed. Which brings me to our next challenge. Oh no, I said. What now? We've been so successful with adaptive tactical thinking that other galactic powers have started to take notice. The Outer Rim Confederacy wants to establish a cultural exchange program to learn human methods. The Free Worlds Alliance is requesting military advisors. And the Neutral Zone Authority wants to hire human officers as conflict resolution specialists. That's good, right? It would be, except that we're running out of humans. There are only so many human military officers, and demand for human tactical thinking now exceeds supply by approximately 400%. I looked around the room at the assembled representatives, all of whom were clearly struggling with the same realization I was having. You need to train non-humans to think like humans, I said. Precisely. Which means we need to understand exactly what makes human tactical thinking effective, codify it into teachable principles, and then figure out how to adapt those principles to species with completely different psychological and cultural frameworks. In other words, Takesh said slowly, you want to reverse engineer human creativity and turn it into a curriculum. When you put it like that, it sounds impossible. Everything humans do sounds impossible until they do it, Admiral Xenobiology replied. Which is why I'm hoping you'll agree to lead the project. I looked around the room again, taking in the faces of beings from across the galaxy, all of them united in their desire to learn something that my species took for granted. The ability to look at a problem and think, what if we tried something completely different? The willingness to ignore established procedures when they weren't producing the desired results. The fundamental human approach to challenges. How can we make this work? When do we start? I said. Epilogue. The long view. 5 years after I first sat in a hegemony conference room and watched alien bureaucrats debate whether humans were a developing species or a catastrophe, I found myself in the same coffee shop in Denver, reading news reports that would have been unimaginable when this all started. Galactic Conflict Resolution Academy graduates, first class of certified creative problem solvers. 3 major wars prevented this month through human-style diplomatic innovation. Economic growth across hegemony space reaches record highs, following implementation of adaptive governance principles. Local restaurant accidentally starts interstellar peace negotiation, after alien diplomats bond over competitive eating contest. The galaxy had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. Not because humans had conquered anyone or imposed our will through superior technology, but because we'd shared something more valuable than weapons or tactics. A way of thinking about problems that prioritize solutions over procedures. The training programs had expanded beyond anything we'd originally envisioned. Every major military academy now included courses in adaptive tactical thinking. Universities offered degrees in creative conflict resolution. There were even elementary school programs designed to teach young beings from various species how to think like humans when faced with challenging problems. My phone buzzed with a message from Admiral Xenobiology, now serving as the first director of the Galactic Institute for Innovative Problem Solving. Alex, the message read, thought you'd like to know. We just received a request from the Andromeda Galaxy Trade Council. They want to establish a cultural exchange program to learn our conflict resolution methods. Apparently, word has spread about our success rates. I smiled and typed back, Intergalactic Consulting? We're moving up in the world. The universe, actually. Are you interested in the assignment? I thought about that as I finished my coffee. A year ago, the idea of teaching alien species how to think creatively would have seemed absurd. Now it was apparently so successful that other galaxies wanted in on the action. Let me guess, I replied. They have some kind of impossible problem that conventional methods can't solve? Three-way war between species that communicate through mathematical equations, interpretive dance, and controlled explosions respectively. Standard diplomatic protocols are inadequate. Sounds like Tuesday. When do we leave? Next month. Fair warning. The preliminary reports suggest this might be our most challenging assignment yet. Good, I typed back. I was getting bored with easy problems. As I headed home, I reflected on how much had changed since that first encounter with Counselor Vexthara. The hegemony had set out to teach humanity proper military doctrine, to integrate us into the established order of galactic civilization. Instead, we'd ended up teaching the galaxy something it hadn't known it needed to learn. That sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to stop thinking of it as impossible and start thinking of it as an interesting challenge. The universe was full of species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of doing things the right way. What they'd needed was someone to show them that sometimes there was no right way, only better ways that nobody had thought of yet. And if there was one thing humans were good at, it was thinking of things that nobody else had thought of yet. Especially when those things involved ignoring the rules, breaking the system, and solving problems in ways that would make traditional military instructors everywhere weep into their coffee. After all, they'd armor-plated their ships against conventional weapons. They should have known that humans would just build railguns that punched right through.